Whether a child is beginning kindergarten, making the transition to high school, or embarking on a new journey in higher education, parents and the public in general expect our public institutions and education leaders to be working to provide the best for their students. Society in general benefits from an educated workforce and responsible citizens. Yet what we often hear about are the problems in the public education system, such as funding cuts, school closures, oversized classrooms, and insufficient resources for overworked teachers. What has been done to address these issues, and what more can be done to ensure all students benefit from quality public education? I'm Paul Shaker, and this is An Education Matter. Our guests today are NDP Education Critic David Cubberley and Awneet Sivia, a coordinator for professional programs in the Faculty of Education at SFU. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There are a lot of dimensions to providing a quality public education system, we know. And I'm wondering, David, if you could start us off by reflecting a little bit on, as education critic, which areas of those you think we could be doing more in, and that you would hope we would do more in the future to address.
Well, I think a couple of areas first come to mind. We have a challenge in British Columbia in that as much as 30% of the kids who show up at school to begin elementary are not developmentally ready for the program that they're going to be going into. So there's a serious challenge both to reduce that number at the front end, and that means moving into the area of early learning and the provision of developmental childcare. But there's also a need for the kids who are showing up who aren't ready to have programs in place to catch and lift them so that we readily bring them up to grade level so that they can progress at a normal rate. We also have a very large special population of special needs kids. Some indication that population is increasing as we become somewhat better at detecting those needs. And we have had a diminishing of resources in the classroom for teachers to use to deal with tailored educational needs for those kids. So we're getting a more complex classroom. We have developmental challenges, and the resources are not really being provided to address those challenges.
Awneet, as you listen to David speak about readiness, preschool, and special needs, as a veteran teacher, are there any of those that you particularly resonate with?
Well, really all of them are issues in the public school classroom, certainly from my own experience, but there are a few issues that I think you raised, David, that are really important to consider. And one of those is certainly the larger number of identified special needs students that we have in our classroom, and it was certainly one of the issues that came up in past discussions with the government around class size and class composition. So in terms of some of those challenges, as a public school teacher, they're in our face every day, and we encounter the issues that brings in terms of designing curriculum and in terms of addressing the needs of each student. Certainly, it's a challenge that teachers continue to take on, and you know, it's starting to wear a little bit thin on some teachers, but it is a challenge that can be met.
We've had a learning roundtable in existence where all the education stakeholder groups meet, except the deans of education, I might say, to discuss particularly class size and composition. This has been more than 2 years that this group has been meeting, David. Why hasn't the issue been resolved?
Well, I think really there's resistance on the part of the government to the idea that there is a problem. The government brought in Bill 33, which was supposed to be a fix for the problem of class size and class composition. There were no firm caps established for the number of special needs kids that could be in a particular classroom, and there were no new resources injected along with that legislation to ensure that there were appropriate supports in place. So without an ability to adjust the targeting of resources to these kinds of populations and for these teaching situations, the problem continues to grow in the classroom. And we are in the context of declining enrollment, which has had an impact on closure of schools, consolidation, and the like. And it means that we're seeing circumstances increasingly where we have split grades, where teachers are teaching 2 grades in the same classroom. You add into that mix all of the special populations that are in the classroom, and you're beginning to have, in some circumstances, an unworkable teaching situation.
Awneet, maybe you could help us a little bit understand what David is alluding to there. You've not only been a teacher, but recently you've worked in our teacher education program, PDP. How are classrooms changing and therefore putting different and greater stresses on the role of teacher?
Yes, the classrooms have changed significantly. Even in the 5 years that I've been working in teacher education, I've seen the demographic changes and the composition changes. One of the things that I'd like to speak to is what we're doing in teacher education in terms of actually preparing teachers for the classroom of today and the future. What we're seeing is that we're needing to develop and prepare teachers who simply are more resourceful and can work within the system that they're entering. What does that mean? Well, it means for a teacher to understand that the resources may not be paper or print, or may not be the kinds of funding resources that really are not available at this point and simply aren't being allocated to public education. So where do those resources come from? And so an emphasis that we have in our program is that the resource is the teacher themselves and the students. The quality of a public education system and the quality of a school and classroom largely is a function of the individuals that are in there. And so what kind of teachers do we want coming out of a teacher education program that can face some of those challenges?
Well, I think you're touching on something that doesn't get much public discussion, but it's how to attract and hold the most highly qualified people in the teaching profession. And that leads to some other discussions like the nature of the workplace and nature of respect for the profession. It's not just compensation, but working conditions also, I think, lead to this. I think to this point we've attracted a very high caliber of person and been able to hold them in the teaching profession in British Columbia from my experience. I wonder, however, if we're missing something in the communication realm as to moving that would allow us to move together to resolve these problems. I mentioned the Learning Roundtable. Is there some other vehicle for discussion and communication and compromise that would lead us to get off the dime and find a solution to these problems that we're facing together?
I don't know if there's a formal mechanism for it that I know of, but I think that there has to be a two-way communication. So the things that percolate up, that are identified as problems, there has to be some ability to resolve those, to see action on them. And what I see happening in the system now is that I think there is fairly good problem identification at the teaching level, at the school level, and to some extent at the district level. But there really isn't an opportunity to say to the ministerial level, the government level, these are the things that need to happen, and to have government involve itself in developing the kinds of templates and the resourcing of those templates that would allow us to address those problems effectively.
Does that call to mind any response for you, Awneet?
Yes. I was thinking about how do we affect change in those kinds of circumstances, because really we're asking for a government to recognize what those issues are. Yeah. And I think perhaps a backdoor way of doing it is to improve the communication between schools and the public being the parents of those students that we're teaching. And in working with the parents, whether it's through a communication about what kind of quality education their child is still getting in the context of that very complex and diverse classroom. There's a very good quality education that's going on. And how to highlight that and how to bring that forward to parents to recognize that there are challenges, and if the challenges continue, whether through funding cuts or through changes in the legislation, where we're at right now is something that's still workable, and we can still grow from this place. But if it changes anymore, you know, we're really in looking at some significant changes to the overall public education system.
There's been some promising work happening in Ontario, I know, among government officials, school people, and the universities, whereby they're trying to move beyond a simple accountability system that's sort of top-down from the government and get buy-in by the other stakeholders, including teachers. And the teachers there apparently have bought in to a great degree, and they found a way to use test information and other data in a way that's compatible with professional autonomy to try to move the schools forward on an evaluation agenda. I wonder if we'll be able to find a way to do that here. As you communicate with the different constituencies you work with, David, do you think that there is a common ground we could find that not only the other stakeholders in government would buy into, but the Federation would buy into in terms of moving a quality agenda forward?
Well, it certainly isn't going to happen by proceeding in the way it's occurring now, which is the generation of data, which requires a tremendous amount of work and focus to achieve, which doesn't result in any change on the part of priorities for the center, the government. I've had the opportunity to ask the minister several times directly about this, to identify a single initiative that they have developed as a result of the scores from FSAs. The minister's unable to do that. Her retort is that it's information for schools to use to compare themselves to each other, and for school districts to examine and to develop things from. My response to that is, if it doesn't show pictures of problems that lead to interventions that are resourced, what's the point of doing it? It seems to simply throw it back on school districts that there's some responsibility to do this. And teachers are clearly frustrated because they don't see change as a result of it. They don't see new tools appearing. So I think this is a challenge. And then it's got the additional layer of the politicization of these numbers by the Fraser Institute, which uses them to rank schools using a completely flawed methodology. So this is deeply irritating to people who are not in a business but are there out of passion to connect to learners to try to improve their circumstance. They're involved in a tremendous amount of activity to generate numbers that aren't used for anything positive, but they see damaging schools.
Awneet, you are a practicing teacher and now a teacher educator. Do you resonate with what David is saying? Is he characterizing accurately from your personal point of view the response you have to the accountability system that's in place?
Yes, absolutely. I was thinking that when you were talking about the partnership between the university and for example, the teachers' union and the government, one of the things that is happening is in terms of those accountability measures, they're externally driven and they're externally implemented. And a big emphasis, at least in our teacher education program, and certainly for myself as a practicing teacher in the classroom, was to read my students, to learn from them, to understand what it was that they needed and how to improve the quality of the education I was providing. And I think that's a big piece that's being missed by the government, is to see what kind of agency and responsibility can be generated from within the system, from teachers, from schools, and in a collective and collegial manner that actually addresses those very same issues, which is how do we improve the quality of the education that our students are getting. And there is, my history as a teacher clearly indicates there's a tendency to be resistant to external implementation of any sort, particularly when it's something that people are very passionate about. So I would agree, yes.
We'll continue our discussion about what is needed to ensure quality public education in BC when we return.
For more than 40 years, the Faculty of Education at SFU has been delivering academic programs that are innovative and responsive. Based on the academic research of our professors and the expertise of practicing teachers from your communities, our programs are designed to meet classroom needs. As a community, we're piecing together a successful education experience for students today and in the future.
Welcome back to the program. One way we could help crystallize our discussion is to take a practical problem and look at it a little bit. And one that's often talked about is dropouts, the problem of students who never finish secondary school. I'd like you to reflect each a little bit on why students don't finish and what we could do better in public education to see them get their diplomas and move on to successful careers in society. David?
Well, one of the things is obviously getting an education completing high school depends on becoming fully literate. Literacy is the challenge, and it's the enabling mechanism for everything that comes after. Kids who drop out tend to have low literacy. They tend to be people who haven't read and performed at grade level from very early on. It's possible to identify that early and to become much better at crafting interventions that catch those kids and lift them so that they begin to work at grade level early. Some of it is not cheap to do. You have to put intensive programs in place like reading recovery or other such programs that intervene in a tailored way to get those kids moving in the direction they need to go. Some kids suffer, and a significant population may suffer from something like dyslexia, which is a neurological condition, which if it isn't detected, cannot be remedied by normal classroom procedure. So there have to be specific programs tailored to these kids, but you have to diagnose it early. So I think a commitment to look at what's happening early on, to make sure there's comprehensive screening so you do detect those kids who are not developmentally ready and begin to track their progress and add resources as needed to lift them is the way to reduce the dropout rate.
Thank you. Awneet, dropouts.
As a former high school teacher, of course, this was an important conversation that we had in our staff and in our schools. One of the things from a perspective in terms of literacy, which you raised, David, is recognizing literacy as embedded in all subject areas, and this was certainly difficult to bring to, you know, the wide-ranging subject areas and the teachers who are working within them. But it's a conversation that's more welcome. Over the years, it's become much more of an important theme in terms of our curriculum development. So literacy from the perspective of a, for example, science teacher. What does that look like, and how do I engage students who may never go on in science classrooms or may never take a science course after grade 12? And one of the things that, as a teacher, I worked with, and certainly my colleagues I can speak of worked with, is this notion of engaging students through their own context. So we have dropout rates that are particularly high for Aboriginal students. And how do we engage students whose sense of the world and ways of knowing the world are so different than the way that we project in the classroom? So I think awareness of that context is really important in terms of enhancing the opportunities to develop literacy. From the perspective of teacher education, I would say that it's actually one of our themes in PDP, in our teacher education program, is curriculum-wide, developmentally wide, and pedagogically wide focus on literacy. And how do we actually construct literate teachers in those areas? And how do we take that component into the classroom? So one of the ways that we're working with our pre-service teachers is to recognize that there is a literacy that's embedded in all subjects. It's part of your skill to bring that out and contextualize it on the basis of the kinds of students that you have in your classroom. And this engagement is extremely important, as well as the diagnosis, in addition to all of the other areas that we need to consider for the student. It's important that students feel engaged, and I think that's part of the issue around dropout.
You bring up the issue of reforms and innovations in education by mentioning, for example, reading recovery, of which I served on the North American Council for some years. There are a number of exciting things going on here in British Columbia, and including in our own Faculty of Education. The Imaginative Education Research Group is quite active in working on a variety of curriculum programs, including ones with Aboriginal populations all around the province. I visited Charles Dickens School recently, a wonderful multi-grade, arts-oriented school in which you can see a very innovative approach being taken that's been there for some years and still has freshness to it. And then there's performance assessment efforts, for example, that are one response to the dilemma we find with accountability and FSA-type testing and the ranking of schools, more authentic forms of assessment. So we do have quite a record of things happening around the province. Some of us, I guess, worry that the oxygen gets sucked out of the media discussion of education and all goes towards school rankings or other controversies like the behavior of a few education professionals that it's out of line, instead of adequate attention to this wonderful spectrum of activities. I'm sure you're both familiar with other things you've seen that are quite remarkable around the province.
I think one of the big challenges in this regard is that there is no formal mechanism, no leadership in this respect to take innovation at the local level and move it around the system. It happens because teachers talk to each other, because schools talk to each other, but it doesn't happen systematically. And there isn't a process of sorting it through. It's almost as if there's a disconnect. Where there's pedagogical innovation, we have an interest in seeing that shared. And there needs to be a more conscious effort made to do that so that these things move around. Now the challenge is, of course, they're great ideas, they have to be resourced. We've seen an example of what happens when government actually chooses to start something new, designs it well, and then funds it in the Strong Start centers that government has stepped into doing. And I give credit for that. But why is there such a reluctance on the part of this government in particular to work with school districts, to come up with the programs that are working, and to help